I would just like to introduce to everybody Mark Evans. Mark works for Eminess and is one of the supply chain leaders there, and was certainly heavily involved with an implementation project for Replenishment Plus, NetSuite in this case, but is an advocate for DDMRP and has really been a great partner to us and helping us develop a lot of great features over the years. And proud to know Mark, proud to call Mark a friend. And I think everybody will be very excited to hear your story here, Mark. So I'll toss it over to you.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks everybody for your time today. I know we're all very, very busy, but hopefully this will be worth your while. So I'm excited to walk you through Eminess Technologies' experience with Replenishment Plus and demand-driven technologies. All right, why is this not working? There we go. Okay, so just a couple bullet points of what we're going to do. I'll start by giving you a company background, just because in order to really understand our experience with Replenishment Plus, you will need to know a little bit about Eminess, who we are, what we do, etc. I'll talk a little bit about our sourcing of planning software and then our implementation and just our overall experience with Replenishment Plus. And then I'll take a few moments to talk about something pretty cool we were able to do with the software to help us navigate all of the uncertainty that COVID-19 introduced to the supply chains over the past year or so. So with that, Eminess Technologies. So what I have on the slide is sort of the official byline. So Eminess manufactures and distributes products for slicing, grinding, lapping, and polishing of critical surfaces to a global marketplace. What that essentially means is that Eminess makes the products that are used in any industry that requires precision surfaces. So when you're getting surfaces down to a level of perfection where the defects need to be measured in microns, extremely high quality surfaces, that's where our products come into play. So we aren't really just a one industry player. Semiconductor is the one that people generally think of, and we certainly do have a footprint there, but we're involved in other electronics, optics, aerospace, medical, you name it if you need a good surface. High-end jewelry buys from us, for example. So this picture off here to the right, this is a polishing process for semiconductor. We don't make the machinery, we don't make the product that is being surfaced, but we make these yellow circles on here. These are templates that hold the pieces in place while they're being polished. And then there's going to be a pad that machine presses down, and then it spins and it polishes. We make the pad, and there will be a liquid slurry that's applied during this process that we also would produce. So all those consumables in those steps come from us. So there's a little 2-minute video here that will give you a little bit of an overview of what we do. It also makes several comments about sort of our service standards, and that's important when you're trying to understand our use of Replenishment Plus.
If your operation involves preparing critical surfaces, you'll already know that Eminess products are amongst the best available in the global marketplace. What you might not realize is just how far we'll go for you. At Eminess, our goal is to be smarter, faster, and more reliable. And here's why. We take time to understand your equipment, constraints, and specifications so we can recommend the best product from our extensive range. Or if you need something more specialized, we'll work with you to develop a customized solution that meets your exact specifications. Because we love a challenge. By drawing upon our extensive application knowledge, experience, and our fast, custom manufacturing processes, we can usually get you a prototype solution to test in a few days. To help keep your process development efforts productive, we don't believe in imposing minimum order quantities. And once you're in high-volume manufacturing, forget about long lead times that bloat your inventory and working capital. Typically, we'll ship the product to you in 2 weeks or less. You can be sure that the quality of Eminess products is consistently high. We adhere to the highest industry standards. For example, many of our products do not ship unless they are manufactured in control. And combined with a level of flexibility you won't find anywhere else, we are uniquely positioned to respond to your wide-ranging requirements. And you can rely on our technical support and expertise in the application, product, and commercial areas, whenever and wherever you need it. Our entire company is committed to building a long-term partnership and helping your company's success. Eminess. Smarter, faster, more reliable.
So the important points to take away from that video, and I hope the sound came through properly, is that in the world that we exist, we're sort of a niche in that we are willing to make customized parts for customers. We are willing to make products at small volumes. A lot of the bigger companies in the world who make the same types of products often have minimum order quantities that simply aren't doable for universities, laboratories, small operations, startups, et cetera. So we've hit an important role there. The other piece is the lead times. So it is not unusual for customers to be facing 10, 12, 15, 20-week lead times in these industries. And even though we're making most things to order, we observe a 2-week lead time. So that requires that our supply chain be sort of built very with an eye towards agility and speed and flexibility. So this map here shows the footprint of the company. We are not an overly complex distribution network. Our facility in Monroe, North Carolina, which is where I'm sitting today, this is a little bit outside of Charlotte. This is our primary manufacturing facility and our primary distribution facility, as well as most of our operations offices are here. We are based in Scottsdale, Arizona, but that is really just accounting and human resources, these sorts of things. We do have an office warehouse in Frauenfeld, Switzerland. This does a lot of our distribution within Europe. So if we're talking about stock keeping locations, it's the Monroe, North Carolina and Frauenfeld, Switzerland sites. In terms of considerations when we are thinking about planning complexity, this slide is meant to just give you a very quick overview. We have about 270 raw materials and 1,000 distributed parts, which are brought in finished goods. So we buy them, turn around, sell them. We don't touch them in any way. But the 270 raw materials go into about 4,500 manufactured parts. And then, as I mentioned before, we have the 2 distribution points. Now, the complexities here come down to what our raw materials are. So our lead times they vary widely. So we can get some products within a couple days. Some take half a year to get. And our suppliers are predictably variable in terms of their reliability. We have some superstars and we have some that require a great deal of management and extra inventory to protect against. The thing that we really have to keep in mind that makes our supplier management more complex is that once our materials are qualified with customers, we cannot just change raw material providers. So the runway to make changes can be upwards of 2 years. And for that reason, we invest heavily in supplier relationship management, and we have to do things from a planning perspective to ensure that we keep the materials flowing, even if the supplier is not the most reliable. Most of our manufactured goods we make to order. We do buffer some items, but by and large, we are making to order and doing it within that 2-week lead time we discussed before. And then the distribution points, while certainly that's not many, we do have a complexity in that much of our material is very temperature sensitive and cannot freeze. And for that reason, we often have to plan 6 months ahead during the cold weather seasons to ensure that the inventory is positioned appropriately in our Swiss location before the temperatures start to turn. So these are the considerations we needed to think through. And before we go any further, I do need to mention that Eminess Technologies, we've been purchased by what was one of our suppliers previously, Microdiamant AG. This happened right at the end of last year. Going forward, actually effective May 1st, we're going to be doing business as Pureon, a new company. And the two companies are really highly complementary. We're in much of the same industries, we're just very geographically complementary. So that is going forward, but today I'm only talking about Eminess because that has been where we've used Replenishment Plus up to this point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our journey. Before we moved to NetSuite and Replenishment Plus, we were doing our purchasing with a homegrown system that was working off a very simple reorder point formula. And I have to say, the results were not terrible, but it required a lot of manual intervention, and there were some limitations that resulted in lots of people being involved in the purchasing and planning processes around the world. So we had sort of functionality defects, and we had just usability defects. When I joined the company, right around the third quarter of 2018, the company had decided to begin a NetSuite implementation. They had already contracted with NetSuite, and they had set a very aggressive goal of being live on our brand new ERP system 4 months later, at the very beginning of 2019. So I had joined at this point, learned just enough about the old planning system and the old way of working to know I wasn't a huge fan. And then we started talking about NetSuite. And it did not take long for me to realize that the planning software within NetSuite simply was not going to work for our company, for a number of reasons. So we started a sourcing exercise to find an alternative third-party planning solution, because we really wanted this thing to be embedded in our ERP system. And we narrowed it down to two options. One was Replenishment Plus, and then another was a more traditional forecast-driven MRP planning software. So we were looking at these two, and I will be the first to admit I knew demand-driven MRP was out there. I had read a little bit about it, but I had no experience with it. All my previous experience was with traditional MRP, and my going in position was that was the direction we're going to go. And then through this exercise, I really started to appreciate what DDMRP brought to the table, and also realized what a really good fit it was going to be for Eminess in particular. The big knocks against going the traditional MRP route had to do with the fact that Eminess historically has not forecasted sales. So in order to do that, we were going to need new headcount and new practices to actually start generating item level forecasts. Replenishment Plus was really attractive to some of our senior people because it looked similar to what they were used to. They were used to seeing reorder points, and the terminology is somewhat analogous, even though Replenishment Plus and DDMRP are a heck of a lot more sophisticated. So it was an easier sell because it was not a completely foreign concept to them. And then as we started to engage with the two companies, what really won us over was just the level of support and involvement we were getting from the demand-driven technologies folks. Right from the get-go, we knew we were going to have a good experience if we went in that direction. And I'm glad we did, because as I mentioned before, we went from no ERP system to being live on NetSuite in the course of about 4 months. And at that time, we installed base NetSuite as the ERP. We installed Replenishment Plus. We also installed warehouse management software and shipping software. So we had a lot of third-party engagements during this exercise. By far, the experience with demand-driven tech was the best. We had the best support. The go live was seamless. We didn't really miss a beat. We picked up on January 2nd, 2019, as though nothing had really changed. Obviously, a lot had, but there was no interruption to the business whatsoever. We had the training in place that we were able to just start that day and start creating work orders and purchase orders and transfer orders like we've been doing it forever. And that's really a testament to the experience we had going through that implementation. So let's talk a little bit about results. So what I'm showing you here is the inventory buffer graph over time, going back to when we went live. And there's a lot of noise isn't the right word. There's a lot of activity here. So let me walk you through kind of what we were seeing. So this initial inventory dip, as much as I would like to attribute it to Replenishment Plus, this was really a significant supplier of ours was having problems at this point, and then they recovered. So what you then start seeing as we work onward from March 2019 through the end, or about a year later, till about March 2020, is this steady decline in inventory that we were seeing as we started to really appreciate the benefits of what Replenishment Plus was bringing to the table. You'll notice there's still a lot of movement in here. And that is because we realized after 9 months or so of really using the software that it was working great, but we could really tweak the buffer profiles that DD Tech had set up for us to really work better for our business and our suppliers. And what we came to realize was one of the big selling points of the software, and one of its big strengths was how flexible and customizable it really is when you get into those buffer profiles. So we embarked on a project right here about a year ago to the day to build custom buffer profiles. And once we did, notice we've continued to see this decline in inventory, but we're also seeing a lot more stability. We're not seeing the kind of jumps that we were seeing previously. The only other thing that jumps out here is this one data point. This is just bogus data in the system. Nothing weird happened. We didn't triple our inventory overnight or anything like that. So by and large, our inventory is down about 12% since we went live on NetSuite, and we were able to maintain service levels of our target, which is 95% the entire time. So we have not dipped below the service at all, moving to new planning software through the customizations that we did, even with COVID, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So by and large, our experience has been very positive with the software. There have been some other benefits just beyond inventory reduction and maintaining our service levels. One thing I had mentioned at the outset was in our old planning before we were on NetSuite, one of the kind of structural limitations of the software was the only way that we knew to place orders every time an order needed to be placed was to have lots of people placing orders. So all of our customer service reps would place purchase orders for distributed parts, and then we had buyers in both the Swiss and Monroe facilities and a person producing work orders, a scheduler in Monroe. Replenishment Plus, because it's integrated right into NetSuite, and just because of the nice views like the planner's workbench, it really let us streamline that. So we've been able to whittle it down, whereas we had 7 people doing planning activities in the old world, we have it down to 2 today. So we have a purchaser and a scheduler, and we have the visibility and the efficiency to be able to do the planning for the entire company with just those 2 roles. That then in turn generated a lot of other benefits. So the activity for purchasing and scheduling was now centralized closer to me, which was nice for management purposes. It's allowed us to manage our suppliers and build better relationships with our suppliers. Whereas before they were getting orders, they might get 4 orders a day from 4 different people, which just drives companies nuts. They were now able to get consolidated orders with 1 point of contact, and that's just had immeasurable benefits to the way that we run our supply chain. The other big benefit was in shipping costs. When we had a bunch of people placing orders, that also meant we were getting lots of individual fulfillments, whereas now our suppliers are in a better spot to consolidate those shipments. And then, of course, all the benefits about inventory levels and cash flow that the system provides. So all in all, these were not necessarily benefits that we expected to have going in, and only appreciated once we got into the software and realized how much it actually changed our way of working. And then before we open it up to questions, I did want to take a moment and talk about how we were able to use Replenishment Plus in response to COVID-19. So Eminess was no different than every other company in the world. March of 2020 sort of came as a shock to us all. And our supply chain, we'd always done risk mitigation things, knowing that some sort of an interruption could happen. Did not necessarily think it would be a year long. So when COVID broke out, we realized that this was a long-term project we were facing. We started to explore what our planning software could do to help us navigate. And we started experimenting with a feature that we knew was in the software but had not really played with before. And the reason we needed to do this had to do with the nature of our supplier base. Our lead times, as I mentioned, some of these are 150, 160 day long lead times. We did not have the ability in most cases to simply start sourcing from alternative places if one of our suppliers went down or transportation lines were cut. And you may remember that as COVID was starting to pick up, the trade war with China also picked up, and we get a couple of our key components from China. So for all these reasons, we wanted to take steps to build our inventory to protect against the variability, but what we could not do was simply go out there and just buy a lot of everything, which I think is what many companies did without better tools at their disposal. So they identified products that seemed to be most critical to the supply chain, and they went out and they bought enough to last a year or two to get them through what was coming. That's not an option for us because most of our raw materials have shelf lives and they expire in 6 to 9, 12 months. So we had to be a little more nuanced, a little more surgical with how we approach this. Now, to be clear, there were some components that don't have shelf lives or have very long shelf lives, and we did buy a lot of those to protect, but that was certainly not the rule. Where we could be more surgical, we wanted to be. And the tool that we used is the feature within Replenishment Plus, which is called the demand order window. And what it does is it tells Replenishment Plus to look not just through the lead time for qualified demand spikes, but instead to look out your lead time plus a certain amount of time, and to take that demand into account when making decisions about what needs to be purchased or made. So what we did is we added 120 days to all of our lead times, and then as we were building work orders based on demand going out that entire time period. So we were essentially queuing up our factory, in some cases upwards of 5-6 months ahead, based on actual demand we had on the books, which then in turn triggered purchases earlier, but in line with actual orders. So we were not just buying a bunch that had a risk of eventually expiring. We were buying material with the known end use already in play, the demand on the books, and therefore there was very little risk of obsolescence. So what this allowed us to do is maintain our 95% service level through the pandemic. We have not dipped at all, which has also set us apart from our competitors during this time period. But the other nice thing is, at the point that we decide we are in the clear, and we are not there yet, we still have this change in our planning system in place because we want to be totally assured that we are out of the woods when it comes to the pandemic. But at the time that we decide that we are safe, we will pull back that demand order window, and we know in about 4 months our demand or our inventories will return to pre-pandemic levels. So it's a really nice demand-driven way of handling a big uncertainty that was in the marketplace. Okay, so we'll open it up for questions, but before I do, I am supposed to remind everybody to submit questions for the big panel that will conclude the conference. So you do that with the Expo button off to the left of your screen, and then there's an option for submit questions for our panelists. So please remember to do that. And with that, we can open this up for discussion, and we can ask questions off in the chat section, or if you're comfortable, by all means, speak up and we can do it that way.
There's a couple already out there, Mark. And
okay,
before we jump in, thanks so much for presenting. And I think, for everybody listening, this COVID situation that Mark described is a really unique way to manage things in our Plus. But I think what it shows me is that, with Mark, we've been live for a couple of years now. Mark and the team are very, very expert in the software and the methodology. And so, using their knowledge and their thoughtware, they're able to move and pivot the system fluidly to, mesh for this very, very tough situation in COVID. And so I think for me, that was just a really exciting story to hear because, you've got a power user and you're using all the tools at your disposal in order to fix a problem. So very, very cool, Mark. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just looking at the questions here. So
cool.
I see a question from Roberta, who's mentioning that our green zones look very large compared to yellow and red. That is true. And the reason for that comes back to the fact of our suppliers. We are actually facing very large MOQs in most places. So those are not green zones based on desired order frequency or anything along those lines. Often those are green zones based on the fact that we are required to buy pretty large quantities when we do purchase. And then I see from Michael a question about what was driving the inventory reduction. So the biggest reason that initially we saw the reduction was in our old world, the reorder point system. Those reorder points had to be maintained manually. And across the number of parts that we were looking at, they simply were not updated enough. That simply requires too much time, too much involvement, and it didn't happen frequently enough, and therefore the reorder point updates always lagged behind the changes in the marketplace that really should have been prompting changes to the way that we were responding. So with Replenishment Plus, one of the big advantages of DDMRP and the software in particular is that as soon as your demand reality changes, your planning model changes. So we started to see that benefit very quickly. The sustained reduction thereafter really came from the fact that we now had enough efficiencies in the purchasing and planning processes that we had people with the time to actually go through and identify opportunities to build better planning models. That was something that we just didn't have in the past. And really the fact that R Plus makes the purchasing and scheduling process so efficient, really freed up the time to let us enjoy the rest of that benefit.
Great. That's great. Hey, Mark, since we've got a couple minutes here, I know some people in the session are, thinking about demand-driven and considering demand-driven. What advice would you give somebody before they start a demand-driven journey or during like an implementation? What's the best advice that you can give based on your experience?
You're talking about if we've already decided we're doing Replenishment Plus and we're getting...
Yeah, if you're going to go on this journey, what do you really need to know?
Yeah. Do your homework, because you do have to understand the methodology in order to get the most out of the software. So the folks at Demand Driven Tech will certainly help you out. They will hold your hand to an extent. They will get you set up for success out of the gate. But if you really want this thing to be a home run, at some point you're going to have to pick it up. It's really, there's a lot of flexibility in there, as I mentioned. And in order to make it work for your business, you really need to know what all those levers are and how they work and how they fit with the overall methodology. So I would definitely say if you're going to go down this path, you need to actually take the time to learn the methodology and the software.
Yeah, that's helpful. We always say thoughtware before software, right? I mean, this is not a silver bullet. This is not a software thing. It's a company change, and it takes really understanding the methodology first and foremost.
Right. And this graph, which I showed before, sort of speaks to that, right? We enjoyed pretty good benefits for that first year using what was basically given to us at Go Live. To really start to then push it to the next level, it required us rolling up our sleeves and saying, okay, what do we need to do to these buffer profiles to make them work for our business? And as soon as we did that, it was a game changer.
Yeah, it's a really neat view. I love this 2-year look at your aggregate buffer trend. I mean, you can see all the things that we look for in terms of a positive trend, both from an inventory standpoint and a buffer status standpoint we see in this graph, certainly. So just awesome stuff. Sean has a question here. Sean, when you customized your buffers, how many did you end up with? What specific changes did you make that helped you stabilize considering your long lead times and variability?
Yep, that's a very good question. So what we ended up doing is making an analog for every one of the buffer profiles that was set up for us by default. So I honestly forget how many buffer profiles we started with. But the reason we just did a one-for-one copy and edit is because the biggest change that we needed to make had to do with the variability bands. So based on the coefficients of variability and the variability bands that are in those standard buffer profiles, almost all of our items were falling into sort of two diametrically opposed. They were either extremely stable or extremely variable. So what we actually went through was an exercise where we started to plot out where our variability actually was. We sort of developed a view of the distribution of the variability, and then took what was a very high variability profile and made another one that was very high, but with different coefficient of variability ranges that allowed us to really start to optimize. So we kept all the same concepts. So you still have the same, you have a buffer profile for every green zone methodology, lead time, make buy, variability combination. We simply started tweaking, well, what does very high variability mean for our business? And that was the single biggest change from the old buffer profiles to the custom ones.
That's great. Well, I think we're out of time, so we're going to go ahead and end the session. But again, just wanted to say thank you so much, Mark. Really means a lot that you're able to speak for us, and I'm sure a lot of people got some great value out of this. So thanks again, man. We really appreciate it. You're really busy, so great.
Absolutely. And I know my contact information is on the hop in here. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. I'd be happy to talk.